Hey class, welcome to another week in History 113. Now, last week we talked about the development of the Cotton Kingdom, which mainly refers to the South, but of course you can't understand the slavery of the Old South and the nation that will become the Confederacy without understanding how it connected not only to the North through financial systems in New York and Philadelphia, but then also connecting to global trade patterns, right? Why was cotton why was cotton king, right? Why was cotton such a moneymaker? Why was it so important? Who was buying it? Who was selling it? What were they doing with it? And so, as a theme in this class, right, this is an argument that I'm trying to make over the course of all these lectures, right, is that slavery develops as a system. So that's why we talked about the real underpinnings, right? How did it actually work? Why would people do this, right? And then you have justifications. And this is sort of a feedback system, right? Most of these peoples, Europeans, Africans, Native Americans, all of which are fusing together into the United States, these people were familiar with concepts of slavery. It goes back hundreds, thousands of years, right? But through the system of plantation, you guess you could call it plantation capitalism, right? Through this experimentation and dominance of a global market, by instrumentalizing not only agricultural goods and making them kind of scientific and managed and organized for the generation of capital, for the generation of profit, but then also turning people into tools, living, breathing, insold tools that then you could deploy to you have human capital basically. So there's a strange way where, even some of the ways we think today about some of this has links deep into this slave system. But okay, we look at that, right? We understand how it really works. They have some ideas, and then these ideas are transformed, right? Slavery wasn't racial, right, when it began. We already looked at that. Slavery wasn't even necessarily permanent. There are cases where slaves sue for their freedom, right? In 17th century Virginia, right? Even though the slaves start coming in 1619, they're not really slaves in the same sense that we're talking about now, right? They could have, they were more on the level of indentured servants, and they could successfully sue and build their own farm, right? There was a part of Virginia we talked about briefly that was free black farmers who could live within the parameters of English law. They were English for all intents and purposes, right? They looked a little funny, not like most Englishmen, but they were English. And it's not until later where this racialization sets in. So the key point, right, we look at the real, and then we look at these kinds of justifications to explain why you're not such a bad person, or ultimately you're actually a good person to participate in this. So it's not wrong to hold another man in bondage and make lots and lots of money from them. No, it's actually the right thing. And it's not really slavery if these people are grown children, right? If they're racially incapable, right? They're inferior at a genetic, biological, or moral level, right? Some people are starting to apply Darwinian theories to the races at this point. Some people are applying some kind of moral failure from hundreds or thousands of years living on the dark continent of Africa. So they're incapable, right? And therefore, you, as a good master, are supposed to uplift them, right? This is the ideology of paternalism. So you're not. So how is that slavery if it's good for them, right? How is this a bad thing if it helps them, right? And you even see people kind of go off the deep end, like George Fitzhugh, who compare this system even to communism, and the idea of building a perfect utopian society where all needs are met, right? It's pretty wild stuff. But in this lecture, we're going to get more into the North, and we're going to discuss how, at first, lots of technological social changes provoke anxiety and panic among people, and the ways they respond to it. Some people respond to it by trying to flee society and build a new world. Other people respond to it by trying to take up the burden of reforming this new society. And this is derived not only from religious cause, right? The idea that United States is a godly nation, that it might be God's chosen nation, with a very special task to spread freedom and republicanism and democracy across the world. But it also, there's also humanistic elements to it too, where you're just trying to build a more effective society for the betterment of man. Nobody was openly atheistic at this point, but it could take more religious or less religious hues. And all of this was responding with rapidly changing environmental conditions, right? We already talked about how the factory system, which began in Great Britain, was starting to crop up in New England. I mentioned it very briefly. We're going to get into that and the kind of dimensions that provokes not only from the owners of these factories, but then the workers themselves. And we're going to see how all of this starts to change the dimensions of what it means to be an American in general, and how this will build up the North into a distinct society that, when faced with a crisis in the 1850s, North and South, for many people, start looking like two different places, two different visions of what America is, two different kinds of government, and that Civil War, formally it's about disunion, but it's really about the role of slavery and what it is that the United States is supposed to be. So let's get into it. A big part of what's going on involves technological change. And I won't get into all the nuts and bolts of how this all took place, but I just want to cover some of the big ones. First, you have the invention of the steam engine, right? I told you briefly that this was linked to this developed in Great Britain, and it was linked to some material conditions, like the fact that there are these huge coal deposits in Britain, and that Britain's forest had been kind of worn thin by using it for heating your home and all this other stuff, right? Now this spread to the United States. Coal was in big supply in the U.S., especially in places like New York and Pennsylvania and Western Virginia. And so you need to burn coal basically to run a steam engine, and the power of a steam engine begins to radically transform the nature of American society. And what I'm talking about is very simple stuff, right? One, you get the development of railroads, which means you can pack up stuff or people or animals in a car and have them driven across the country at a much quicker rate than a horse, right? So movement, the country shrinks and the interconnection between parts of the country begins to expand. It doesn't take so long to get from one place to another. Another key element is the application of the steam engine to a boat, so the steamboat. Now this is really important because if you think of a boat, how does a boat get anywhere, right? One, it has to go with the flow. It's got to follow the currents of the river. So that means you can only ever travel in one direction. Or two, you got to use a sail, which also depends upon wind patterns. So you can't just travel anywhere. If you look at the map very early on in the book, when you look at the triangle trade or the Atlantic trade, or how Europe went to Africa and then to America and back, it had to follow a very specific current. Why? Because those are wind patterns. You can't just travel any which direction, and you can't come back the way you came. But with a steamboat, you can. You can push against this, right? This transforms how rivers are being used. Rivers are now being developed as basically highways. You can go up and down in whichever way. Railroads are being developed in the north and in the south, right? And they're both linked to trade. Now, the north, it will be much more interconnected. You'll see a graph how many more railroads are in the north than the south. But the south is participating in this project too. And in their case, it's about moving cotton. In the north, it will be about moving grain and about moving finished textile goods. But we'll get into that in another part of the lecture. Additionally, right, with the development of the steam engine for the steamboat, you also want to create, there's also a push to create new waterways so that boats can move through popular regions. And so one of the key elements of trade was developing the series of rivers that could move between the Great Lakes, starting with Erie, out to the Atlantic Ocean, and particularly out to the Atlantic Ocean through New York City. So this is what I'm talking about in the past lectures when I mentioned John Quincy Adams and the idea of liberty is power, was that someone like John Quincy Adams, he had the foresight, he had the vision to basically see, look, if we want to fulfill Jefferson's vision, if we want a free republic of people who have self-owned lives, the only way to do that is to use the federal government to develop the nation as a whole, right? You can't engage in these giant infrastructure projects just at the state level. they'll be too poor. They might snipe at each other and backbite, right? What's good for New York might not actually be good for Pennsylvania. What's good for Pennsylvania might not be good for Ohio. So you need a national government to bring a sense of unity and purpose to these large-scale infrastructure projects. Now, this was not terribly popular for a lot of reasons. One, there was a strand of Jeffersonian thinking that kind of interpreted his appreciation of small government as almost a philosophical idea. Government should be small because government needs to be small, not because of issues related to corruption or the vision of what the country was supposed to be. And we kind of went over that, was Jefferson a hypocrite when he used the federal government? I don't think so. I think it's a development of his original principles where it's using the government to sort of create economic democracy. Anyway, you had some opposition from those people, and you had opposition from people who were very well entrenched in their own state governments. And by giving the federal government this kind of power, it seemed to chip away at the rights of the states, which meant their own power base. So the Erie Canal was sort of a complicated project. It involved some national money, it involved a lot of state money, but it's this huge overhaul of the environment, and New York City gets a huge boost in terms of trade. Um, and this project, right, this transforms, not only literally transforming the environment, but things literally come out of nothing, right? So you build this canal, you have to hire all of these workers. Where are these workers going to live? So you start building encampments for them. These encampments start to attract merchants who are going to sell things because you need food, you need clothes, you need other stuff. And then, after just a little bit, boom, these encampments have turned into cities. So Rochester, New York takes its origin as an Erie Canal encampment kind of developing. It might have been already a town at that point, but it becomes a city with colleges, with high rises, with all this stuff, right? There aren't skyscrapers, but the buildings are starting to sort of develop because of technological adjustments. The development of steel is starting to happen in this era. So these places just sort of pop out of the ground, and they reflect these changing environments, right? Cities are becoming more and more prevalent throughout the United States, and we're not going to get to it in our period, but city life is becoming more of a norm than the much more agriculture and agrarian early republic. The generation of the founders. Most people did not live in cities. Most people still don't live in cities, but cities are becoming more of a norm, right? And all the problems that they bring. Another major invention is the telegraph. You probably don't even think about the telegraph. You might not even know what a telegraph is, right? The telegraph is that, sometimes you see it in old movies or something, or movies talking about this era. And the movies, or in the telegraph, it's that beep. It goes beep 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 beep, right? Okay. Now the importance of the telegraph, right? It's been totally eclipsed by the phone and the internet. But the importance of the telegraph was this was the first major kind of communication that could travel rapidly, and link together parts of the world that had never been linked together before. So in the past, right, if you wanted to report back to Washington, D.C., say, about what was going on in a war front or what was happening here or there, you'd have to send a messenger. And so that messenger would have to travel by horse or by ship. Think about trying, right, the War of 1812 ended before the last battle of it because nobody knew that the war had ended. The treaty process hadn't been hammered out yet, and it took a month for a guy to get back from Europe to the United States. With the telegraph, this shrinks all of these dimensions, right? So the telegraph is first used during the Mexican-American War, and this gives James K. Polk a much stronger command of the battlefield. He actually knows what's happening. He knows what his generals are doing, sort of, right? He knows how many troops he has, how many troops he's lost, how many casualties the enemy suffered, and so on, right? This will be super important for the Civil War, where both Jefferson Davis, who's the president of the Confederacy, and Abraham Lincoln, who will be president of the United States, will have a much stronger grasp of what's actually happening on the battlefield, and they'll more or less operate like commanders, even though they're not generals on the field. So here's just an image, right? You can see how many roads, canals, railroads were expanding, right, interconnecting many different parts of the country. John Quincy Adams, one of his major national projects was to build a national road system so that the roads actually corresponded to bigger patterns than just what was beneficial to a state. So you can see a lot of this stuff was built in the north, but it also applies to the south as well. Now, the next part of the lecture, I want to talk about the growth of evangelicalism and the Second Great Awakening. So the main part of this graph, I just want you to note, is that when the Second Great Awakening happens, all these groups expand. You can't really see all of these. Some groups don't do a whole lot of expanding, though they do a little bit. But the two major groups are Methodists and Baptists. And we won't get into all the reasons why. I'd argue it has to do with their organizational capacity and the ability for the layperson who feels called to kind of go and do the preaching themselves. They don't rely on a super professional or highly educated ministry, but we're going to get into the reasons why. Now, we hadn't really spent too much time with the First Great Awakening. There's something about that in your textbook, but I'm just going to fold that into the Second Great Awakening because it's basically a deepening and an expansion of the same set of themes. Now, in the First Great Awakening, the idea was that God had sort of intervened in the lives of a lot of common people and was basically bringing about a revival, a restoration, a renewal of Christianity among the people living in the North American colonies. Now, when this happens in the Second Great Awakening, right, it's the United States at this point, it's much larger, it's much more intense, and the emphases in the First Great Awakening are kind of developed in a much stronger way, meaning that people really do feel more empowered to kind of go out and preach the Word of God. Now, to basically sum up what makes this movement unique from just regular Christianity, or whatever that might be, it's a very broad concept. There are a lot of different elements, pieces to it, but let me just summarize it for you. The Second Great Awakening and the First Great Awakening emphasized God's ability to speak to anyone. So within more established churches, whether it was the Anglican Church in places like Virginia or Maryland, or if it was the Congregational Church in Massachusetts, the point was that these ministers had to go to school. They went to seminaries, right? So Harvard, Yale, Princeton all started out as seminaries to train ministers. William and Mary College in Virginia started out as a seminary to train ministers in the Church of England. And so the idea was that the person who's leading your church should be called from among a group of people who tend to be more elite, right? Not everyone gets to go to college. Not everyone gets to go to Harvard, right? Harvard was just a little school back then, but the colonies didn't really have universities or colleges, not like Oxford or Cambridge or many of the schools back in Europe. These were pretty small and inconsequential. But these schools develop as in concert with the elite people who live in the colonies. As the colonial elites become more important, and as the United States develops as a nation, these institutions become more important. Now, there's a very strong strain in Christianity that emphasizes that God does not depend upon human needs to accomplish his goals. So God can lift anybody up, do whatever he wants, and kind of set him on his way to go and preach his word, to go and make his will known. Right? So there's stories from the Bible like Balaam's ass, where this guy's riding a donkey, and the donkey tells him, his mouth is loose. God speaks through this donkey and tells the guy that he's out of his mind, right? Because, there's a whole story about that. But the point being is that if God could talk through a donkey, God could talk through anyone, right? Anybody, no amount of education, right? And that this transformation can happen in an instant, right? So they'll look at the examples of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, where he's converted on the road to Damascus, right? He's hit with a blinding light, and all of a sudden, here goes from persecutor Saul to now Christian evangelist Paul, right? All in a moment, right? That's how it's being interpreted. Also, other figures from Christian history, particularly the life of Martin Luther, where he has this conversion experience. This was developed by a group of called the Pietists. We won't get into them, but they feed into how this is being developed. So the idea was that regular average people can go through this radical conversion experience where they go from a life of being a run-of-the-mill sinner to being somebody who feels that they were called by God to sort of spread his church, to spread, his kingdom in whatever way that actually, takes place. And two groups that are really efficient at adopting this method, this form of organization, are the Methodists and the Baptists. We won't get into their actual distinctions, but just suffice to say, both of them do not put a high premium on the need for their ministers to be highly educated, right? If you feel a call from God, you feel the need to go out and preach, then you go and preach, right? I'm not going to restrain you. I'm not going to question what I think is God's work. And I'm not going to try to send you off to some school where I lock you away for 6, 7 years where you learn ancient languages, mathematics, physics, Bible commentary, and so on. All right? If you got the word, you go. Now, this is a faith that also highly prioritized this experience of conversion, which then, and then right on top of it, you're not going to school, you're not trying to educate yourself on all of what that might mean and how to best understand it. So this was highly emotional. And you don't have to go through the church, you don't have to go through the Bible. You can have this sort of one-on-one confrontation with God, where God will select you. And so this unleashes lots of preachers throughout the countryside, the most famous of which in this period is a man named Charles Grandison Finney. Now, Finney was a kind of run-of-the-mill New York lawyer. In his own account, he gets really depressed one day. He's thinking about suicide. He goes down to the river, and boom, he has this conversion experience, right? He feels God call him from a life of mediocrity as a lawyer to a life as an evangelist, going out and preaching. So that's him right here, a picture of him preaching to a whole bunch of different people, right? And as you can see, a lot of these folks look very common. You got black folks, you got white folks, you got women, anyone, right? And so this is going to have a kind of important impact for what we discovered or what we discussed among black Christians in the South, right? If God can talk to anyone, that includes slaves, that includes women, right? Why can't they be preachers? Why can't they go and spread the word? So that's going to develop from this. But in Finney's life, a key difference between the first Great Awakening was Finney's conviction that preaching, that evangelizing, that spreading the word is actually kind of like a science, right? It's something, he compares it to the farmer who learns agriculture, right? It's a skill. You learn how to do it. For the first Great Awakening, for preachers like John Wesley and George Whitefield, when somebody was converted, this was only a supernatural event. God actually had to do something in your heart. It was not something that was manipulable. It was not manageable. You couldn't game it. You couldn't provoke things. It was all in God's time. It was all in God's work, right? But for Finney, it's not that he doesn't believe in God's work. It's just that he believes it comes by human means. So in some ways, Finney helps develop and kind of runs concurrent with the idea of marketing and advertising and the science behind that. So Finney develops a concept called the anxious bench, and we won't get into all of that, but it's basically trying to provoke people into a reaction. You preach intensely angry, God's wrath against man's sin, right? Boom! People are reduced to tears. They're sad. They're grinding their teeth. They don't know what to do. They're angry and totally demolished. And then you come with the soft words of grace, right? You are not abandoned. God loves you, and He will forgive you. Turn your life around and, convert. So, therefore, you're met with tears of joy, happiness, dancing. Some of this stuff is met with kind of, for outsiders especially, strange exuberances of the spirit, where people are laughing and crying and barking like a dog and going into almost epileptic shocks. It's very emotional. So when these revivals roll in the town, it's a whole event. It's not just you can't just box this as religion. It's also a spectacle. It's fun. People go. It's like a carnival. It's all sorts of crazy stuff. Why do people watch horror movies? To get scared and shocked. Why would you go to a revival preaching? Because it really touches you in your core. It scares the living hell out of you, in some cases literally. And then it provokes, again, why do you watch a movie like a rom-com where you get all, maybe for the ladies out there, right? You watch it, You get, weepy-eyed. It makes you feel good, right? Why do you watch it? Because you like the emotional rush. Why do people ride on a roller coaster? Because you like the emotional rush. So that's a lot of what went into this. But this is obviously in Finney's idea and a lot of these revival preachers. This is for a good cause, right? Carnivals, riding on a roller coaster, that's self-indulgent, right? Why do you do it? It's for fun. For this, why do you go through this? So that you can become a better man or a better woman. We'll get into some of the reform elements. But the whole point of Finney's work was to change American society for the better and to kind of bring it closer to God's kingdom. Now, this could split into many different ways. For Finney himself personally, this developed into a kind of abolitionism. This meant that Finney was radically opposed to slaveholders. He withheld the sacraments of the church, so he wouldn't give them the Lord's Supper. If you know what that is, if you don't know what that is, you should just check it out real quick. The importance of it for Christianity. But he would withhold that from slaveholders. He'd basically say, "You're not welcome here. You're not a Christian." Finney would also help develop colleges for freed slaves to come, and they could learn how to read and how to write, and also learn, if they want, to be a preacher. Finney also developed a college for women. Finney's wife was very much active in women's reform movements to empower women to go out and to preach in the same way that men can. Now, he didn't consider women and men to be the same. They didn't necessarily have the same rights or same capacities or abilities. But he did believe women had the same, at least the same potential to be called by God for the work of ministry, right? And so a lot of women's reform movements at this time advocated the same. We'll get into some of this more later. But just suffice to say, Finney wanted to transform the world, and so therefore, for some people, right, most of this was about trying to change society. But for some people, it was about politics, right? It also might mean you need to get into politics to help clean up the corruption, to help develop the morals of society, ban evil things, and help create a better country, right? Of course, for critics of this, and there were critics, right, this is unleashing insanity. This is putting people who are ill-trained and uneducated in places of power where they don't even know what to do with it. This is privileging emotion over intellect. So you're just going with your gut feeling and your instinct over the ability to actually articulate something and understand it at its most core level. And it resulted in a lot of fraud and showmanship. A lot of some of these revival preachers were fakes. They brought people out with the entertaining qualities of it, just to basically fleece them. They get their money, they get their support, and they'd roll out of town. Some of these people were immoral. Some of these revival events turned into, there's reports of this from some critical preachers, that these revival events would be attractive to young men who would take advantage of girls in their emotional state, right? Everyone's kind of hopped up and worked up. And so this girl, she's looking for God, and this guy is just looking to get in her pants. And then next thing you know, she's pregnant, he's out of town, and she's been ruined, right? No one's gonna marry her now. That's how people saw things back then. So there were a lot of critics, right? But this kind of goes concurrently with Jacksonian democracy, the idea that the common man is capable of running things for himself, that you don't need this caste of elite people, these caste of elite institutions to manage the high levels of American society. No. Any man can do any job if you just give him the chance, right? And if you work hard enough for it, anything's possible. Of course, some of you might find this inspiring. Some of you might be cynical and find it nonsense. There were people who were true believers in some of this. There were people who were frauds, and we're going to get into a little bit about that. But this starts to change American society, and of course, in part at least, if not mostly in part, it's a response to the changes of the literal landscape of a world that's being built out of the grounds, that agrarian ways of life are giving way to urban ways of life, that new technologies make new things possible. So for someone like Finney, right, this is God's hand over America. He's changing things and rapidly developing the world to make it a better place. Now, I mentioned only some evangelicals, so only some associated with the Second Great Awakening, will get themselves into politics, but we're going to look at how that develops. The first major thing is the development of the anti-Mason party. Now, this isn't strictly evangelical, so I want that to be clear. This is not a religious party. It's not a paranoid party. It actually is grounded in a much more deeply rooted American tradition of Republican virtue. But what is the anti-Mason party? Well, if you look at this symbol here, if you've ever seen this, this is the symbol of Freemasonry. We won't get into all what Freemasonry is, but Freemasonry at this point was a secret society made up of generally elite people. George Washington was a Freemason. Many of the American founders were Freemasons. Many French revolutionaries were Freemasons. Many members of the British elite, the aristocracy, and the government, especially those who are more on the liberal side, they are involved in Freemasonry. Freemasonry basically was an institutionalization of deism. So the idea that you don't need a specific Christian revelation, you don't necessarily need a Bible. Instead, you imagine God as the grand architect of the world, right? So that's what the G represents, and you got the compass and the ruler. And so God's designing the world, and so like God, we can participate in this and kind of create the world with Him. Right? Design it, develop it, make it better. It's very optimistic as a creed. It really believes in man's powers to develop himself, but it comes as a secret society. In the United States, Freemasonry rapidly expands throughout the country. Many lodges, and that's where Christians have churches and Jews have synagogues and Muslims have mosques. Freemasons have lodges. Now, Freemasonry is not exactly a religion. It involves religious aspects. It has political elements, but it's also a social club. So as Freemasonry spread throughout the United States, a lot of people who are trying to get in on things, trying to climb up the social ladder, would join the lodge. Many major Americans at the time of the anti-Mason party were Freemasons. Andrew Jackson was a high-ranking Freemason. Henry Clay was a high-ranking Freemason. So what provokes this, right? What causes this panic? There's a man named Daniel Morgan. Now Morgan, he's afraid. Right, Morgan is an ex-Mason, and he starts printing out letters in his newspaper describing what Freemasons do. Right, he reveals their secret rituals, which is a no-no. Right, they're a secret society. You're not supposed to tell other people what goes on behind closed doors. He starts talking about the rituals. He starts talking about the people who are a part of it, right? Again, it's secret. No one's supposed to know. And he starts talking about some of the shady things going on, right? If this is a secret society made up of people who are both elites and people who want to be elites, then you're going to privilege your brothers in the lodge over total strangers. So this seemed to be a way of basically taking over government, taking over society in a way that's imperceptible to all the Americans who are not a part of this. So there are many farmers, particularly in New York and Pennsylvania, who are very much attracted to this message, right? Morgan ends up, his printing press gets burnt to the ground by some angry Freemasons who are trying to shut him up. And then he goes missing. The last anyone saw of Morgan was getting into a carriage with a couple of well-known Freemasons. And then he's gone. A couple weeks later, a body's discovered upriver in Niagara area, and it's reputed to have been Morgan. Now, there's questions on whether this body actually was Morgan. The criminal investigation, the CSI type, technologies and skills are not really well developed. So it's not like they could take his, a blood sample and figure out DNA. Who is he? But it's reputed to have been Morgan. It might have been Morgan. Chances are it was Morgan. But this creates this panic, right? Not only do you have this secret society that's, this secret government that's secretly ruling things, right? And so that's what this political cartoon, right, is all about. You have government officials doing things, but who's actually running things? Big boss Freemasonry, right? So if you're a politician and there's a higher ranking Freemason running the lodge, are you going to follow his orders? Are you going to appoint lower ranked Freemasons to positions of government? Is that how you're going to choose them? Are you not going to choose them based on their merits, based on their abilities, based on what they can do for the people, but based on rather these secret connections, right? This was part of American republicanism, but this also fed onto this evangelical crusader mentality to clean up society. So as the Republican Party, the Jeffersonian Party, is starting to fracture, a new political party develops in the 1820s to oppose this level of corruption. And most importantly of all, right, and this is 1828, remember, right, they're worried about the influence of Freemasonry at the highest levels of government, right? Who had just been elected president? None other than Andrew Jackson, a high-ranking member in Freemasonry in his lodge back in Tennessee. Now, was Jackson really some kind of Freemason, secret agent running things for an evil cabal of corrupt elites hiding in these lodges, appointing all of his cronies based on these connections? No. But you couldn't know for sure, right? I mean, certainly in smaller towns, social climbers would join these lodges and they would somehow mysteriously become, given government contracts to build things. They get awarded with offices, they get awarded with positions. So there was corruption in the sense where Freemasonry would build this social network that would allow people to sort of scale up without going through the public eye, right? And so for people who are on the outside, maybe it was bitterness, maybe it was jadedness, maybe it was rooted virtue where they're just concerned about the corruption of their government. But this really drove them to organize, and so John Quincy Adams, right, he becomes a member of the anti-Mason party. So it's not just like a bunch of rednecks and maniacs, right? It had populist dimensions to it, right? It was a concern for the people over the corruption of all public goods by an elite few who are squeezing them for their own benefit, right? And in this case, it was the benefit of the Freemason lodges. Now, by the end of the 1830s, the anti-Mason party will fold into the larger Whig party, which you saw a little bit about in the documentary, and it's in your textbook. But its origins have to do with this reform mentality that we got to clean up corruption in society. And so from the anti-Masons into the Whig Party, right, and so that's the path John Quincy Adams takes, you have the development of what's a wing of the Whig Party called the New School Whigs. And these Whigs are basically people who are more concerned for changes and developments within American society that benefit the moral reform of people, right? So it's about not only rooting out corruption, but maybe it's about banning the use of alcohol, maybe it's about expanding the right to vote to women, and most importantly, for New School Whigs, it's about restricting slavery. Some of them are abolitionists, some of them are part of the colonization societies that want to send free slaves back to Africa. We'll get into that in a bit, but this develops a kind of new political movement. Now, besides reform movements, people who just want to clean up corruption, make society a little bit better, at least in the political realm, you also have new developments, both religious and not religious. Some of them are just, strictly atheistic, but both of them share this common trend of pushing towards utopia. So there are efforts, right? The society's changing. People are anxious. People are panicked. So how do you develop a better world, right? As these cities pop out of the ground, there are all sorts of problems with urban life. There's public health issues, right? And so there's a huge cholera epidemic during the 1820s and 30s due to poor public health, contamination of water supplies. Think of all the things that have to go into a city, right? You probably don't even think about it. You got to have water, right? Not only for a sink in your kitchen so you can use water to cook and to bathe, but then also water that takes out your waste, right? You need a sewer system, right? And in this case, major cities basically had open sewers, or you had chamber pots where you just empty the contents of your toilet out on the street. You got to have garbage pickup, right? People use stuff. Where's it going to go? Bones, pieces of vegetable, right? What are you going to do? In places like New York City, you actually had people just let loose roaming packs of pigs that would eat the garbage. So, imagine you're outside, you're looking, and there's a bunch of pigs outside. You're living in New York City, and they're pigs. They're also horses because that's the form of transportation. They're also cattle because people are bringing their cows to market to sell them for beef or for milk or for whatever. And what are all these animals going to do? Right? They expel waste. So who's going to clean that up? So it's a huge public safety issue. There's crime, right? Street lamps are being developed. The police departments are being developed to sort of at least create this sense that you can't just commit criminal activities. But there's a lot of crime in cities, and so people out of self-interest and self-protection will either join or help create gangs. So immigrants coming to New York will form gangs. People living there previously will form gangs. Right? The Irish are the most notorious for the gangs they formed. What's called 5 Points. New York, it's a part of New York City. It's also Hell's Kitchen. Now, if you ever see the movie Gangs in New York, that's part of what it's about. And this is developed from city life, but also just the challenges of the new economy that's developing. People fighting over jobs, people fighting over good pay, and we'll come back to a little bit of that over anti-immigrant hostility. But society's changing, and so some people think it's better to just opt out, try to build a new world somewhere else. And the United States has got a lot of land, a lot of opportunity for people to just kind of run away and do their own thing. So there are a variety of different communities. I'm not going to get into all of them. So you have what's called the Millerites, which will eventually develop into what's known as Seventh-day Adventists. But they think the world is going to imminently end and that Jesus Christ was going to return sometime in 1841, 1842. Obviously, he does not return. This movement gets shaken, but they flee society for these purposes. Another pretty wild movement, which was considered very strange by the morals of the day, were the Shakers. Shakers are not like Quakers, and they're not actually called Shakers. They were known as Shakers because of this weird dance that they would do. And they would do this dance for hours and hours and hours, singing and dancing in gender segregated lines, to kind of shake out the sins in their heart. And so what mainly this meant was sexual frustration. Shakers were a celibate community. You would move there, you would renounce family, you would join a gender segregated commune. So men lived in one dormitory, women lived in another dormitory, and that you would live together kind of in harmony. The movement was run by a woman who believed either that she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ or that she had a special kind of relationship with the Holy Spirit. But this community thought the world was imminently going to end, so therefore you wanted to recruit people to live a righteous life, away from the corruption of the cities and away from the decadence of American society in general. Right. Now these are both religious movements. There were also a-religious or irreligious movements, so I won't get into too much, but you have the Transcendentalist movement, which was it was more a literary movement, but elites in New England kind of moved away from Boston, they wanted to move away from the city, and they wanted to get in touch with God through nature. And so a lot of American poets, famous poets like Ralph Waldo Emerson, they're transcendentalists. Walt Whitman is affiliated with this movement. And so it's this idea that the only way to really get in kind of have communion with God and nature is by separating yourself from society and kind of going out in the woods and live by yourself. Now another movement that was a lot more communal based were the Owenites, and this was based off a guy named Robert Owen, who was a British factory owner. And the Owenites believed that you could kind of create basically a communist utopia by just sort of moving out and trying to develop a new way of social organization. So they didn't ban sex, but marriage was not permitted. You could sleep with whoever you wanted. The community would raise the children, right? So there was no private ownership of children. There was no private ownership of property. Everybody worked. Everybody received compensation. And this wasn't based on anything linked explicitly to God, right? In fact, a lot of people could be atheistic or or just not particularly involved in religion. But this was a new way, right? We're trying to figure out the best way to organize society. So the optimism of social transformation, right? We're going to do it right, right? The rest of society is kind of hurtling towards chaos, but we're going to organize it right so then everyone else can see us, and then maybe all of the United States or other countries in Europe will copy us. That was the idea. Most of these communities fell apart. There's actually one Shaker left in the world. I'm not sure how this person is still a Shaker or survived, but there's still literally one Shaker. A lot of these groups changed to adapt with the times, but it reflected the anxieties of the age, right? All of these groups shared this idea of pursuing a perfect world, whether it came from God or came from man's own spirit. Most of these groups required you to leave society, either to form a new commune or to live by yourself, and they radically restructured society. So the Owenites banned marriage, and they had communal ownership of property and communal raising of children. The Shakers were completely celibate, or no sex, no marriage, nothing. And and the Shakers were being run by a woman. So these are all pretty radical to the rest of American society. And like I said, they're adjusting to the new changes throughout the world, the rapid urbanization, these new technologies making all sorts of things possible, creating this general sense of anxiety, right? It seems like the world is about to end. You can't, people who went from horseback carriages to trains billowing out smoke. New England transformed from a mostly agrarian and rural place with little towns dotting the countryside, with Boston only being the real major city. Rapidly, it's becoming industrialized. So all of this is feeding into this change sense that the world is not the same, America is not the same, and who knows what the future will be. Now, a lot of these trends, both for social reform, political reform, the sense of apocalyptic end of the world, the idea of forming a new commune in response to changes in American society, conflicts between the rest of America with these new movements, all of these can be summed up in the history and story of Mormonism, or as they prefer to be called, the Church of Latter-day Saints, right? And so this represents not just an American religion as I write, but it really reflects the changing ethos of the age. So let's get into it. This guy on the right here, his name is Joseph Smith. He's like Muhammad for Islam, for the Church of Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith is born into a poor Yankee family. They're farmers living in upstate New York. These are the kinds of people who would have been concerned about Freemasonry. These are the people who would have been members of the Second Great Awakening. This is part of what's known as the Burned Over District, where there's so much preaching, so much fire from heaven, so much kind of anxiety of being damned as a sinner and being saved by grace, that some people started to become kind of jaded and bitter. Others, they've heard this before. It starts a ranking contest, like, oh, this preacher's not as good as the last one. But a lot of people are really involved in this, and Joseph Smith is no different. He's a very precocious young man. He's pretty insightful. He has this unique kind of charisma about him. So this helps explain why he's able to gather several followers to himself. But Joseph Smith claims during the 1820s to start receiving visions. He goes out into the woods, right, to make a long story short. He's approached by an angel. He's approached by God. He goes out in the woods and he reputedly finds these golden plates, right? And from these golden plates that he supposedly translates using a divinizing crystal has a place in the Bible, but is then used by Joseph Smith to uncover this story, and this is ultimately what becomes the Book of Mormon. In this story, ancient Israelites escape from their home right on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. They sail and sail and sail, and they will eventually land in the Americas. So where this reflected some theories about where did Native Americans come from. They came from ancient Israel. After a dramatic story of Israelites both fighting amongst each other with the natives, a fall into idolatry, a raising up back into faithfulness, they're eventually visited by Jesus Christ in the year 500 roughly, and then these faithful Israelites are wiped out. Joseph Smith is there to recover the faith that the apostles once had, basically to restore the true Christianity that had been lost. Right? Joseph Smith, like a lot of people in this age, they see a lot of different kinds of Christians, they see a lot of different movements, and they say, where's the true church? Where's the true movement? Right? What should I be doing? Where is God actually at work? And so Joseph Smith believes himself called to be a prophet, and he publishes this new text as the Book of Mormon in 1832. Joseph Smith, during this process of translation, has attracted a lot of followers, right? About roughly a dozen or so people are interested and participate in this activity. And he begins to form, right, a distinct movement, right, the Church of Latter-day Saints. Now, first, this movement is strictly communal, right? Joseph Smith, like I said, he's very charismatic and he has a real knack for organization, right? And he's also has a very strong personality and can kind of keep people together, right? So this could be described as a kind of authoritarian move, or at least authoritative, right? He can dictate rules. He can hold the community together. There's not chaos. There's not too much infighting. And he brings everyone to a little town in Ohio called Kirtland. So this movement keeps expanding. They try to reach out to Indians and evangelize them, believing they're the successors of the Israelites. They ban coffee and tea and alcohol and tobacco from their movement, right, which is all part of this social reform, not being given over to corrupting drugs and chemicals. And Joseph Smith continues to receive prophetic inspirations. But after a series of problems with the community, there was some financial strife. The community goes bankrupt because it started its own little bank, and there was some fighting. Joseph Smith packs up his bags and he moves to Missouri. Now, in Missouri, the Church of Latter-day Saints continues to expand, continues to attract followers, and thus begins to attract suspicion. A lot of people in Missouri aren't sure about these newcomers, right? They move to a new town called Independence, Missouri, right? So none of these, it's the kind of social anxiety that no one knows anyone. They're all moving west, all trying to get their piece of the pie, and they see this weird commune movement, right? Everyone there generally is kind of moving out there with their family, but here you have a communal movement. They're a little bit secretive. So Joseph Smith actually, right, while he was a young man, kind of searching out for which church, and he moved and jumped from one group to another. At one point, he was a Freemason, so he kind of learned some of these Freemason tactics about how to organize, how to keep an in-group that's separated from an out-group, which is separated from strictly outsiders. So Latter-day Saints refer to these outsiders, these non-Mormon Missourians, as Gentiles, right? Which is, had some slur, some kind of negative connotations associated with it. Now, as all of this is developing, Joseph Smith continues to receive prophetic inspiration. He receives some doctrines that he doesn't share with other faithful members. At one point, Joseph Smith begins to implement polygamy, which means men may marry more than one woman. So this is a part of the Church of Latter-day Saints until later in the 20th century, where the president of the church, who claims the same prophetic powers as Joseph Smith, received a revelation and said, okay, we're not doing that anymore, which may have coincided with the fact that Mormons were trying to adapt more to American society, and they didn't want to be viewed as total weirdos. But most Americans found polygamy to be disturbing and deeply immoral. But so he's still receiving these revelations. There's revelations even about a divine mother, that, how was Jesus born? It was because the divine soul of Jesus was born from God the Father with a heavenly mother. But some of these were not meant for average run-of-the-day or average run-of-the-mill Latter-day Saints, and they were definitely not meant for these outsiders. Now, strife begins to pick up between the Mormons and the non-Mormons. In an effort to defend themselves, Latter-day Saints form a militia group called the Danites. So these guys are armed with rifles. They're there to protect the community from strangers who might be there to rob or hurt or any kind of sow discord among the Church of Latter-day Saints. But of course, to an outsider, now they got guns. Now they're patrolling. What do they want next? a number of Missourians form their own militia, and this ends up creating what's called the Mormon War of 1838, where the Danite militia and the Missourian militia start to fight each other. Eventually, Joseph Smith intervenes. He says, "Look, fine, we're gonna stop the fighting. I don't want any violence. We'll just move out." So after this fighting for about a couple of months, Joseph Smith packs up his bags, tells everyone, right, we got to stop fighting, we got to cut our losses, lose our property, let's get out of here. And so from there, they move to Nauvoo, Illinois, which is a sacred site in in Mormon belief. From Illinois, most people there found the Mormons to be odd, but they didn't find them hostile. Now, Joseph Smith actually tries to run for president in 1844, but this doesn't really work. He wanted to reform society in kind of following Mormon beliefs, but also some general trends among evangelicals and other humanist reformers. But this is where real hell comes out. Some of Joseph Smith's followers, along the way, there's communal strife, people who have disagreements with Joseph Smith, and they'll find themselves leaving the Mormon level, or they'll find themselves leaving the Mormon movement, and they come from every level. Some of them are very low level, some of them are at the highest levels of authority. Well, in Illinois, some of Joseph Rank's high-ranking lieutenants decide not only to leave the movement, but to go to a printing press and to start leaking these secret doctrines that Joseph Smith did not want the outside world to know about. Right? One of them, and the most important of them, at least for the outside world, was polygamy. Joseph Smith, over the course of his leadership of the church, had taken several wives to himself. This was not knowledge for everyone, especially not knowledge for the outside world. This was only for people who were initiated, who could truly believe these kind of esoteric beliefs because their souls were pure enough. They could actually get it. Now again, for outsiders, this seemed to be sneaky and corrupt. Here Joseph Smith is openly, or he's secretly practicing immoral things that he's hiding from the rest of his followers and hiding from the outside world. Also, some of the beliefs that were leaked with the idea of a heavenly mother, this seemed to be polytheism, right? That Joseph Smith and the Mormons believed in multiple gods. That this was bad. Smith denies these allegations, but also coordinates with some people to go and shut these people up and smash up their printing press, right? There are some parallels with what happens to Morgan. This creates popular outrage. People are upset. They don't know what to believe. They don't know what these Mormons are doing. This is very suspicious. Their way of life is strange. These people look weird. And so a mob of people in Illinois formed to take out Joseph Smith. Now, the Illinois governor at the time arrests Joseph Smith for the destruction of this printing press, but the mob won't have it. They will rip Joseph Smith and his brother and someone else. They'll take him out of the jail cell. And I guess the governor is not protecting it, or he's not going to risk this kind of public whiplash against him being associated with the Mormons. And so this mob rips Joseph Smith out of his jail cell and they lynch him. So he's murdered, not with trial, right? This is like a posse, right? This guy's a criminal. We're not going to wait for the judicial system. We'll issue our own justice. And so they kill him. From there, the movement follows in the footsteps of Joseph Smith's right-hand man, a guy named Brigham Young, which is where Brigham Young University gets its name. And they decide that trying to integrate or live close to the rest of the United States is hopeless. In fact, Brigham Young's not even sure that Mormons should participate in the United States. Rather, maybe they should form their own country. So they travel very, very far west. There's a whole saga about how the challenges of them traveling, a lot of sickness and death. There's robberies, there's Indians. They eventually make their way to Utah and form a new country. Brigham Young becomes the president of a new republic, but quickly within this world, it kind of shrinks as Utah is absorbed by the United States. And so then from there on, Mormons are, to one degree or another, trying to adjust to living as Americans, but at the same time preserving their own faith and preserving their own way of life, which includes things like polygamy, which most Americans find disturbing. There are a variety of other things we won't get into, but Mormonism represents, a lot of the anxieties, a lot of the fears, a lot of the chaos of these new changes and reforms in America, right? Mormons want to make America a better place. The Church of Latter-day Saints wants to lead people back to the truth. Joseph Smith sees himself as a prophet and as a political leader, right? He tries to run for president of the United States to no effect. But all this is to say, right, this movement, right, which still exists today, the Church of Latter-day Saints, is relatively wealthy, relatively influential, right? Their home base is still Utah, but there are Church of Latter-day Saints offices throughout the world, in Africa and Asia and Europe. They have what they call temples in many different places. So this movement is still with us today, but its origins represent this kind of swirling cauldron of change and anxiety and confusion and angst and the desire to make heaven on earth. Now, only to contribute to these problems is the issue of immigration. So again, this phenomenon should not be, strange to you, right? We're still dealing with immigration and the problems that are associated with it. On the one hand, right, you want the country to be open, you want new people to come in, but then, what if these people aren't like us, right? What if they don't look like us? They don't sound like us? They don't believe the same things we believe, right? Are they going to threaten our values as a society? Are they going to take us over? And more importantly, to some, what about jobs, right? They got to come here, they're going to work. What are they going to work for? What if they throw away all the hard-earned privileges we earned because they're desperate, right? What do they know? They don't know anything. They just got here. So a lot of these issues are still applicable, but in the case of the 1820s through 40s, and really into the 60s, it really has to do with two main groups. The first group, which is not so important, are Germans, and the second group, which is far more important for developing a kind of American identity, are the Irish. Many of the Germans who come are Catholic, and all the Irish who are coming are Catholic, and so this brings in a kind of culture war mentality. Catholics are not the same as Protestants. Protestants are learned to fear Catholics. Why do they fear them? Catholics follow a pope, right? The pope is believed to be this basically king of the church. He lives in a faraway country. And so Protestants are suspicious that Catholics may basically be taking their orders from the pope. And what does the pope have to say about America? What does the pope have to say about a Republican form of government? What does the pope have to say about democracy? At this time, not very good things, right? So a lot of Irish Catholics, a lot of German Catholics spend a lot of time trying to explain how they can be faithful Catholics and be good American citizens. And many of the Irish and the Germans who come, they join the Democratic Party because the Whigs become the home and harbor of many of these hostile elements against these immigrants, right? Right? If you're trying to reform society, these people are getting in the way, right? They don't want to change. They don't want to be like us. So how can we possibly integrate them within broader American society? Now, long story short, the Irish and Germans very well adapt to American society, but there's a lot of chaos and a lot of fighting. And a lot of people who are being pressured by these new groups coming to major cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, places that are very well associated with the Irish. This is how they view them. They're like apes. And so this comes back from a kind of medieval symbol where the ape looks kind of human. He can mimic human behavior, but he's not a human. So you got these Irish, they look kind of human, but they're not really human. And there's a long history and tradition of anti-Irish sentiment from people in Great Britain. But, right, they see the Irish as these apes. They fight all the time. They're always drunk. They're always just drinking whiskey. They piss away all of their earnings, right? So they're kind of making society worse. And so within these urban environments where you're competing for jobs among poor laborers, both black and kind of what would be called Native Americans, so not actual Native Americans, not Indians, but Americans who are here for generations, right? They probably have English origins. They feel competition. So there's a great line from the movie Gangs in New York where the main antagonist, the villain, played by well, it doesn't matter, but the character's name's Bill the Butcher, and Bill the Butcher says, what a white man would get paid a quarter for, a black man would get paid 10 cents, and an Irishman would get paid 5 cents, right? And so his point is not about the employers basically skimming off the top. It's that these new policies of immigration and integration, of bringing in all of these Irish, and many of them are coming because of a potato famine that was particularly horrendous and was created by agricultural policies back in Great Britain. But these people come in, they take our jobs, and they do it for cheap, right? I want to do this job, I'll get paid a quarter for it. But these guys, they're just trying to live. And so employers take advantage of this new reality, and they'll say, hey, I'll do this, you can do this for a nickel, right? Now, this creates a lot of strife. Now people are losing their job. They're being confronted with a way of life, this kind of well, not only because they're Irish and German, so they sound funny if they're Irish, and if they're German, they don't even necessarily speak English, and they're just kind of getting in the way of transforming America. They're not so much interested, at least on the surface, of kind of engaging in these reform projects, of trying to earn labor rights. No, all right. Eventually, right, they'll kind of do it in their own way, and the Irish will become the backbone for the Democratic Party in New York City and in other major urban areas, because the Democrats become the least concerned about trying to, right, Democrats tend to be at this period, right, this is also the party of the slaveholders, but also the party of the small government Jeffersonians. So they're not interested in forcing the Irish to be one way or the other, as long as they'll come in and do jobs and work and whatever. So they become the most hospitable for the Irish to become a part of. And they will participate in politics in this way, and the Irish will argue it's okay to be Catholic and American, you can have both, but there are a lot of people who are suspicious and they're worried, and the economic factors about urban life really contribute to it. Now, on top of this, right, besides the political reforms, there are also all sorts of social reform movements. So one of the major ones is the idea of creating public schools. Many of you probably have gone to public schools. Their origin in the United States comes from this era, this idea that if you want a functioning country, if you want a functioning republic, you need to invest in the future of its citizens. They need to be able to write. How could they know how to vote if they don't know how to read and write? They need to be able to do basic math. And they need to be able to basically do the kinds of jobs that are being created in these new urban and rural environments, right? So there's a positive aspect to this, right? It's about creating good citizens. Now, of course, this also includes lessons in civics, right? What does it mean to live in a republic? What does it mean to participate in democracy? How do you know how to vote? What is voting? What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to act? That was also part of the public school movement. Now, for Catholics who want to create their own school movement called parochial schools, they were hostile to the idea that they have to go to these public schools. Why? Because they didn't want their kids to be indoctrinated in basically Protestant ideas. They wanted to teach their kids how to be good Catholics, how to respect the priesthood, how to participate in the liturgy in their own church. Now, eventually in places like New York City, compromises are made that parochial schools will be allowed to exist alongside public schools and alongside other private schools. But the idea is you're trying to form citizens with a common set of values where you can all belong as one country. Now, the negative side of this is also that by trying to train people for life in factory work, you might be indoctrinating them and kind of trying to adjust them and force them into the mold of these new societies. Maybe the public school movement makes you more compliant and less resistant to the idea that you basically have to follow your boss, you got to listen to him, there are certain rules in the factory, and you got to just go along with it, rather than saying this is inhuman, no one should have to do this, all right, we should push for reform. So there's a kind of sinister aspect to public schools in that way. Right? Conformity is good, but conforming to what? Right? What if it's conforming to an evil or unjust system, right? And making it normal for you. That, oh yeah, of course, this is how it's supposed to be. Rather than saying, well, no, this is sick and wrong. Another reform movement was to try to change jails from being strictly a place of punishment to a place of moral reform, right? You shouldn't just go to jail where you get beat up or whipped or put in the stockades to publicly humiliate you and therefore just simply to punish you, but jails should reform criminals and convicts to make them back into good citizens. So the idea that you can remodel people through education and social control, which again, it seems optimistic. Hey, people don't have to be bad. People can change. But the negative aspect is we can make people change. We can control how we change them. So if we design our jails in a particular way, we can force values down their throats and transform them, whether they want it or not. I'm not going to get into it too much. There's more in your textbook, but this is the era where you see feminism develop, the idea that women should have a stronger place in political and social life among men. Now, this originates from early American ideas of Republican motherhood. In short, the idea is that the outside public world is where men are, the inside world of the home is where women are, and the two should try to be held as distinct as possible. Now, this came down to differences between the genders. Men were active, they were strong, and they were willful. Women, on the other hand, were emotional and pious. So their best place was to help raise good citizens, to take care of the home, and kind of protect the family hearth, right? Right? You're about protecting the morals of the home, where in the outside world it's cold, it's corrupt. There are a lot of evil men out there, right? And in this time, women were considered to be more naturally virtuous. So whereas men were the tempters, the men were out there trying to seduce girls, trying to give away their virtue, trying to say, hey, baby, if you stay with me, I'll love you forever, and then dumping her, right? Men were bad, and the outside world was fit for them. The women were good, and they needed to be protected in the inside world, right? Because they lacked the strength and the intelligence that men had to sort of participate in that way, but were more naturally good. Now, some women started to use these types to basically advance their own interests. They said, well, look, right, if we're more moral than men, shouldn't our moral compass be a part of public life? Shouldn't women be a part of government to keep men honest? If government is strictly the domain of men, and men are seducers, they're corrupt, they're chasing after pride and ambition, shouldn't there be a woman there to keep him in line? Keep the government honest and moral, right? Don't we want to make America a better place? How are we going to do that if you keep women in the home? So the idea was that women need a stronger place in public society, and maybe women should even be able to vote, right? Women have that capacity. Women are the moral vote. Of course, right, when feminism actually advances and the women get the right to vote, the idea that women would vote as a gender turned out to be not true at all, right? Women vote however women vote, right? Women voted for Democrats, women voted for Republicans. They voted for both. So this idea that the female vote would act as a block turned out not to be true, but this is the ideas they basically formulated. And then finally, another major reform movement, which doesn't take off till later in the 20th century. So if you take a U.S. History 2 class, you're going to learn about Prohibition. But the idea was alcohol was a corrupting factor in American society. Now, this emerged from both humanistic movements and also evangelical movements. And this was the basic story, right? It would get serialized in these kind of melodramatic novels that would get published. And so this is what would happen. You got the average family, right? So the guy goes to work. He's in the factory. He's working on crafts or whatever. He makes his money. Now he's coming back home and he's got his check in his pocket. What's he going to do? Go home with his family? That would be the right thing to do. Or maybe he could go to the bar. He gets a couple drinks in him, then he gets a couple more, then he gets a couple more. Next thing you know, he has no money left. He spent all of his money drinking. Then he goes home. His wife says, honey, it's so late. Where are you? What have you been doing? Where's the check for the work he done? He said, I don't have it, right? He's drunk. He's out of control. She's getting upset. She's starting to cry because, oh no, we're going to be poor, right? He gets upset at her. He beats her in the head, right? He starts domestically abusing her. The kids say, what's happening, mommy? Right? Here's mommy getting beat up. The kids terrified, right? What's going on? Other family members are disgusted. The marriage starts falling apart. Maybe the guy maybe the guy dies from cirrhosis of the liver. Maybe the guy dies in a bar fight. So now the woman is left destitute. She doesn't have a husband anymore, so therefore she doesn't have a paycheck, and so maybe she turns to unseemly things, right? Either she starts living in the street or living in a poorhouse, or she becomes a prostitute, right? Anything to just survive so she can put bread on the table and save her kids. And all of this would have been prevented if only there wasn't alcohol in the picture. So that's basically this melodramatic story that plays out during the 19th century. So temperance movements start, right? These are kind of voluntary clubs where they try to promote government responsibility about the creation and distribution of alcohol. Mainly they want it to be banned, right? A good Christian person is not going to sell himself over to the bottle, right? He's going to live a life of virtue, trying to make society better, not enslave himself to intoxicating substances. And therefore, right, alcohol is too addictive, too out of control, and too destructive that we got to just remove it from society. So a lot of these arguments are parallel with issues about drugs today, right? Should drugs be legal or illegal? If they're illegal, what should you do with them, right? Do you have police basically trying to hunt down any kind of drug dealer? Are you just going to create a black market economy? Should you trust the individual to use it? Are there some drugs that are worse than others? But this all really roots, and of course, there's also kind of religious or moral questions, right? What kind of society do you want to be, right? Do you want to be a society of meth heads? Do you want to be a society of drunks? How are you going to prevent this, right? So that's what temperance was about. And it's not very successful in our period, but its origins take place here, and they take place in this idea of trying to reform society and make America a better place. Now, besides moral reform efforts, there are also economic reform, right? The changes within laboring society among workers, right? What was going to happen to them? Now, throughout this period, as a consequence of Jacksonian democracy, a lot of urban laborers start to form what are called working men's parties. So one of the more famous and successful ones, the Massachusetts Working Men's Party. New York has its own working men's party. Some of them maintain their own kind of independent existence. Others basically become wings, on the radical left wing of the Democratic Party. But, left wing doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but they are kind of more on the edge. They want to change the dimensions of society more. So that's, the left-right distinction. It's not very helpful, but if it's more useful for you, then you can use it. But the idea was that these workers need to be protected. With the advent of these new machines, remember we mentioned in the last lecture, a lot of individual artisans are left destitute, right? These machines can pump out more shoes, more shirts, whatever, than the average guy working on his own workbench. Now, if the average guy working on his workbench is reduced to an unskilled laborer, he loses his ability to maintain his own autonomy as a citizen, but then he's losing his own ability to set his own rates. Right? If you work in a factory, you get what you get. There's no minimum wage, and even today, right, minimum wage isn't enough to really sustain you. You got to make more than that, or you got to work a lot more hours. And in these factories, right, the factories could work you for 70 hours a week, right? People complain about 40 hours a week. This is basically double that. You could be working 12, 14-hour shifts 6 to 7 days a week. Children would be working, right? I mentioned all this stuff. This all happens in Great Britain first, but it comes to the United States as these things develop. Now, it's never as bad as in Great Britain because the factory system takes a lot more time, in our period at least. It becomes a lot worse in the later part of the 19th century, but that's for U.S. history too, so I'm not going to get into that. But wherever it develops, wherever the factory system starts cropping up, these working men, these laborers are trying to protect their own interests, right? So it's the right, factory owners try to crack down on workers organizing. And why would they organize? Because a group of laborers is stronger together than just one by himself. So this is the advent of what are called unions, labor unions. Labor unions still exist. Maybe some of you are part of labor unions. Maybe some of your family members are members of labor unions. They're not as prevalent as they used to be, not as powerful as they used to be, which has negative consequences for many workers in some industries, but nevertheless, these labor unions helped protect their interests, and the political party was basically trying to inject that within the world of government. So what did the working men's parties want? Right? Not only was it the right for labor unions to begin to organize based on certain craft types, so there were unions of like shoemakers, unions of textile workers, and so on. But they also wanted limited work hours, right? So the 10-hour work bill was the most, you might think that's nuts, right? Today we have 8 hours, but 10 hours was radical. These factory workers fought tooth and nail for this, and they were opposed at the highest levels of society. So if you think you should be grateful for that it's only 8 hours anymore, but they had to fight really hard to get hour restrictions. Imagine your boss could have you work 14 hours a day if you wanted, and if you were worn out, you were too tired, you didn't want to do it, he'd just fire you and replace you with someone else. Right? Boom, you're done. Right? And then you'd be in the poorhouse. There's no social security. You can't file for unemployment. There's none of that, right? No food stamps. So you end up in these volunteer poorhouses, or they're also called almshouses. And you get a kind of handout, but it's not enough to live, and a lot of people died in destitution. So when someone like George Fitzhugh, right, the advocate of slavery, he looks at the North and says, "What the hell's going on up there? You think you're criticizing us? You got guys dying in the street, right? We don't have that with our slaves. Our slaves love us because we take care of them." Now that was all a lie. It was nonsense, at least in many cases. Most slaves wanted to be free, or at least wanted their master to basically leave them alone. But working conditions in the North were pretty bad, especially within these urban areas. And like I said, they weren't necessarily safe. Now, on top of that, working men participated in basically a Jeffersonian idea of America. They were concerned at these factory owners basically gobbling up all of the industries, taking away all of these independent craftsmen, reducing them all to unskilled laborers that could be changed out like a part. And they were worried about the influence of these people, right? More money meant more power, and the more power you had, the more you could basically take over society. So they saw American politics being dominated by a few wealthy, what are called plutocrats, or people who rule by money, oligarchy. This is a constant fear within American society, and it's totally justified. So a lot of these laborer slash worker union parties, these working men parties, were against any kind of monopoly, where one group gets total control over all things. They were against the banks. They were against corporate industry all developing into kind of a conglomerated whole, right? The idea of capitalism on its basis is competition, right? So these people generally weren't, some of them were what we would call socialists or communists, but most of them wanted to basically pursue the truth of capitalism, which is competition, right? Every man kind of competing, and the best man wins. Now, if you do that, right, that's how capitalism justifies itself. But right, what happens in effect? Do capitalists really want to risk losing all of their money by, having a war to the death with another capitalist? No, you just try to fix prices. You try to work together. And so for a lot of workers, this basically screwed them. It became a kind of class warfare where the wealthy owners take advantage of their workers and put them in an impossible situation. So a lot of workers pushed back against this, and because of this, they were divided over the slave question. Like George Fitzhugh again, right? The North is a horrible society. And so Northern workers said, look, the conditions of the factory worker are far worse than the conditions of the slave. Is slavery good? No. Do we want to abolish slavery? Yes. But is that more important than getting these reforms passed? Are we going to abandon the Democratic Party, the only party that's going to protect our interests and advance these causes? Are we gonna give up on them? No, of course not. Right? We'll work with the slave owners in the South if we can push back against the factory owners in the North. So this will split some working men's parties. They will eventually, over the 1850s, realize, no, slavery is actually just as bad, and we need to put that down as much as we need to change the rights of the free worker. Right? Those two causes must go together. And so eventually some of these people will fold into the Republican Party. Others will stick with the Democratic Party because they don't trust some of the people who have joined the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party had always put their interest, somewhere kind of, into the center of their platform. Martin Van Buren was very popular among many of these Democrats. They were known as Loco Foco, which meant, for them, it referred to a self-propelling train. So this movement was the movement of the future. It was the power of this self-propelled train. It was the technological future of the country. But for people who are making fun of that, they split this into loco, which meant crazy, and foco, which meant kind of fiery. So these people were on fire and they were nuts, right? Um, the etymology doesn't matter, but it just shows you where kind of people were, lining up on these issues. And so one way this manifested itself, especially among factory workers, and that's what this picture is about, and part of the text you're going to read for this week and analyze, was that in places like Massachusetts, most of the workers weren't men, like they were in places like New York City or Philadelphia, but they were girls. These were girls who were not yet married, some of whom would never get married. But the idea is, while you're waiting to get married, while you're kind of growing up, you should work in a sewing factory. You learn some skills, you make some money for yourself, and you get to be with other girls. You get to hang out, right? It's great. It's great. But it's horrible, right? Factory conditions were nightmares. They worked 12, 14-hour shifts. They get paid pennies for doing, really intensive, unskilled but intensive work. And so some of these girls actually started to organize. They started to say, hey, look, we know our rights. We're Americans, right? We're the future mothers of America, and you're going to work us to death? Like, I don't think so, right? So they start to organize. They push for higher wages, but this strike ultimately doesn't work, right? And a strike, again, if you don't know what that is, that's when everybody walks out. Nobody's going to work. Shut the factory down until you meet our demands. So it was a kind of economic violence. It's not physical violence, right? You're not hurting anyone, but you're trying to put the factory owner into the corner. You're trying to box him, and make him have to decide, right? Either blow yourself up and destroy your own factory because no one's ever going to work it, or meet our demands, right? Submit. Now the Lowell, Massachusetts, right? That's a mill town. This mill girl strike is ultimately ineffective, but it shows you some of the issues at play, right? Labor reform was on the horizon and will become much more important at the other end of the 19th century. So don't forget labor reform. If you go on to take a U.S. History 2 class, ask about populism, ask about labor reform, ask about unions, right? Got to understand that stuff if you want to understand American history. And finally, we arrive to the other major feature of reform movements, which is abolitionism. Now, abolitionism is different from colonization. Colonization was you you want to free the slaves, but you're not going to integrate them into American society, right? Not all abolitionists believe full integration, right? Some of them are segregationalists, right? Whites have their stuff, blacks have their stuff, but they should all be free. But colonization, people wanted to send them back to Africa. So the country of Liberia gets its origin as a colonization movement. The United States buys a piece of Africa, turns it into its own independent country, and then says, look, we're going to send the freed slaves back there because there's no way they're going to ever be able to be a part of the United States, right? This reflected the attitude of someone like Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, where no, slavery is wrong, but whites and blacks will never get along. Maybe because blacks are racially inferior. Maybe because they have all this, they're going to have a lot of cultural prejudice. Right? We held them in bondage. What are they going to do? Right? It's only going to create race war. So the best thing to do is just send them home. And by home, it's just some random part of Africa and just ship them back there. Whatever. Right? Now, the abolitionism was about not just ending slavery by freeing slaves and sending them back to Africa, but ending slavery forever in American law and making blacks a part of the United States, whether as part of the single nation, right? Abolitionists might be divided over whether blacks should have the same rights, but they should be free, right? No question, no doubt about it, at a national level, end slavery. Now, one of the major figures in abolitionism was a guy named William Lloyd Garrison. He was a kind of he was out in left field as a Quaker. He was a pretty radical, heterodox Quaker. He had some pretty unconventional beliefs, but he was adamant slavery must end. Slavery is evil. It has to stop right now. So he was a newspaper editor, and he ran his journal called The Liberator, and it was all about abolitionist stuff. Of course, as you might expect, Southerners were really annoyed with this, and they banned the sale or the distribution of this newspaper and throughout their states. And even the North found this kind of irritating, but we'll get into some of why in just a second. But William Lloyd Garrison was distinctly committed to this moral crusade that as a Christian, that as a Republican American, right, somebody committed to the foundations of this country and what it was liberated from under Great Britain, what its independence was about, right? It's not true unless it's true for all, meaning it has to be true for black folks, right? So the slaves must be free. But William Lloyd Garrison was more of a social reformer. He didn't have any high opinion of politics. So as a Quaker, he was a pacifist. He didn't believe violence would work. So you could not end slavery by war or by bloodshed. He also thought politics were corrupt. He thought there's no point in trying to end slavery by getting involved in government, trying to join a political party that's about ending slavery. Right? Forget it, right? The whole system's corrupt. And in fact, he thought the United States as a history, right, was founded on slavery. So there was a kind of ironic, maybe, parallel with someone like John C. Calhoun. Both John C. Calhoun and William Lloyd Garrison both believed that the Constitution defended slavery. Right? As we mentioned in an earlier lecture, historical scholarship now and some contemporaries in the drafting of the Constitution actually believed that the Constitution's compromise and its ambiguity was ultimately a blow against slavery. So slavery is not even mentioned in the Constitution, meaning that there's no protections on it. Therefore, you could undo it as much as you could promote it, which created anxiety among Southerners, especially as Northerners were opposed to the slave economy, and powers linked to abolitionism started to get a foothold within American politics. And one of the great advocates in American politics was none other than John Quincy Adams. But William Lloyd Garrison had no high opinion of this, right? He thought the U.S. Constitution was evil. It was a compact with Satan. It was about protecting the rights of slaveholders. But politics was useless. Violence was useless. The only way to win people over was through moral suasion. You got to convert them. And so Garrison was in the big business of printing out slave stories, right? So if slaves would escape slavery, they'd come to the North. They're all kind of beat up and degraded, and they tell their story of how they were whipped, they were harassed, they were worked to the bone, they were raped, and all these horrible things, right? The South was a degenerate, morally corrupt, evil place, and the slaves bore witness to that in their bodies, right? And so how could you, as an American, not listen to their cries, not listen to their plight, and remain, deaf and dumb? How could you do that, right? You can't. You got to listen. So Garrison really believed that's how it worked. Now, for a critic of William Lloyd Garrison, and I think there's something to say about the criticism, he usually gets high praise in textbooks in most classes on American history. But from the critic's point of view, look at what he's saying. There's no political issue besides slavery. Or actually, there's no issue besides abolition and slavery. So for people who are slaving away in the factories, for the Lowell mill girls, for people who are in these working men's parties, you need to shut up, right? Your issues are not important. You're not a slave. You should be happy. You have a job. You're free, right? So William Lloyd Garrison really had nothing to say to the average worker, right? You should be happy with being paid a penny for an hour of work, right? That's what American society is about. That's perfectly fine. So he was a single issue guy, and he was really shrill. So someone who might be favorable to abolition, right? Some of these workers, some of these other northern critics of the slave power, they say, okay, well, Garrison, how are we going to do it? He would say, we got to get rid of it right now. Well, okay, well, how are we going to do it? I don't care. We got to get rid of it right now. They need to stop being evil, stop being evil, stop being evil, get rid of slavery, or else. They say, okay, man, what are we supposed to do about it? Right? Just keep writing these pamphlets, right? No one's going to listen to us. They don't care. You're just making them angry. No, we have to get rid of slavery right now. So that's my little dramatization of how a conversation between Garrison and some of these other groups would go. Frederick Douglass becomes, he's a friend of William Lloyd Garrison, but he finds him a little too high-strung and panicky, and ultimately giving up the best means for curtailing slavery, which was in the realm of politics. Plus, he didn't like being treated as he was kind of an outlier. They were more interested in slaves who were kind of degraded, and they had these real sob stories, not with Frederick Douglass, who tells this tale of how he became a man. Now again, Frederick Douglass don't get me wrong, Frederick Douglass is opposed to slavery. his whole point, though, is that you actually got to grow up and become a man and get involved in the cut and thrust of government, right? You gotta turn to that if you actually want these issues solved. You can't just keep writing these sob stories. They're not going to work. No one's going to listen to you. Right? Abolitionists, even though many people in the Republican Party, which we'll talk about next week, are against slavery, they don't want this immediate abolition. It's not possible. We can't force the southern states to get rid of this. The federal government can't do this. It's not going to send down an army and police them unless the South provokes us. So Garrison didn't really have that many followers, and most of his followers were, I guess, what you could consider them what's called limousine liberals. So people who are very engaged in activist causes, but they're from a wealthy background, and they're not really living in the mess of things, right? Their hearts bleed for the slaves. They want to help them, but there are all sorts of other social problems, as we saw, and they're not really thinking about that, especially in ways where they could be a lot more effective, like, hey, how do you treat your factory workers? But nevertheless, Garrison helps get the words out that slavery is a moral evil and you got to make a decision. It's not something you can compromise on. But in the political world, a abolition party is developed called the Liberty Party. And they believe that you can chip away at the power of slavery through government action, right? It doesn't have to be all at once. It can be progressive. You got to form coalitions, but you can break it down, eventually keep it contained within the South, and then drive it out one by one. So this was ultimately what split some abolitionists, right? Do you do it in a gradual way, piece by piece, forming political coalitions, taking step by step, or do you require instant, immediate abolition? Also, right, do you do it through government or do you do it through some kind of social activism? Now for Garrison, right, Garrison seems like a hero, right? See, look, he took no compromises. He refused to even look at a slave owner, right? He wouldn't stop his movement for anything. He was on a crusade. He was going to change the world. But then a critic might say, but what did he actually get done? What's the point of being so pure in your ideas that you actually leave people in the worst condition possible? And with Garrison saying that the U.S. Constitution, which founds the U.S. government, being totally corrupt, totally evil, without any hope of redemption, you're only going to shore up the South and say, look, if you want to free the slaves, you're going to look like that guy, right? Do you really want to look like William Lloyd Garrison? Do you really want to hate the founding documents, the founding fathers of our country? The answer would be no, right? Most people still liked people like George Washington and Jefferson. People still do. So this really split people down the line. Some people sided with Garrison. Some people sided with people in the Liberty Party. Liberty Party was never very powerful. It was basically a single issue political party, but it becomes influential when it folds into the new party system of the 1850s. So in next week's lecture, we're going to come to the impending crisis, the looming feel of civil war, the ethos that the North and the South have some irreconcilable differences, and that maybe a division is inevitable. Maybe not war, but it's some kind of division. But we're going to see how that all plays out in the course of next time. So I'm John Parks. I'll see you. Peace. And watch out. Take care of yourselves. Bye.